The sound of shattering crystal echoed through Lumiere, Beverly Hills' most exclusive restaurant, as 7-year-old Matteo Moretti hurled a $300 wine glass against the marble floor. Tears streamed down his face as he screamed words that made grown men in thousand suits back away in fear. But Grace O'Sullivan didn't move. She knelt beside the broken child of America's most dangerous man, her gentle voice cutting through his rage like a whisper in a hurricane. "I know your heart is hurting," she said softly. And for the first time in months, the little boy who terrorized nannies and bodyguards simply stopped. In that moment, surrounded by chaos and crystal shards, something shifted. The waitress, who was invisible to everyone else, had just seen what no one else could see. Not a monster's son, but a broken little boy who just wanted someone to stay. The black Escalade pulled up to Lumiere's valet stand at exactly 700p, its tinted windows reflecting the golden California sunset. From the passenger seat, 7-year-old Matteo Moretti pressed his small face against the glass, watching well-dressed couples disappear through the restaurant's gleaming doors. "Your father will meet you inside, young master," said Vincent, the bodyguard assigned to Matteo for the evening. His voice carried the same careful tone everyone used around the boy, part respect for his father's name, part fear of his unpredictable temper. Matteo said nothing. At 7 years old, he had already learned that promises about his father were usually lies. Inside Lumiere, crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in crisp white linens. The restaurant buzzed with the quiet conversations of Los Angeles' elite movie producers, tech moguls, and politicians who paid $500 per plate for the privilege of being seen here. Grace O'Sullivan balanced 3 plates on her left arm while refilling water glasses with practiced efficiency. At 24, she had been working at Lumiere for 8 months, long enough to become invisible to the wealthy clientele, who barely acknowledged her existence. She preferred it that way. Invisible meant safe, and safe meant she could keep sending money home to her grandmother in Boston. Table 12 needs their wine, called Henri the head waiter, his French accent thick with irritation. And the Hendersons are asking about their appetizers again. Grace nodded, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. She had learned to move through this world like a ghost, efficient, silent, forgettable. It was a survival skill she had perfected over years of working multiple jobs to support herself and her ailing grandmother. The restaurant's heavy doors opened, and Vincent entered with a small figure beside him. Matteo Moretti looked like any other wealthy child in his pressed navy blazer and tiny dress shoes. But Grace noticed the tension in his small shoulders, the way his dark eyes scanned the room with an alertness that seemed too old for his face. "Moretti's table," Vincent told the maitre d', who immediately straightened. Everyone in Los Angeles knew the Moretti name, even if they pretended not to. "Of course, right this way," the maitre d' said, leading them to a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. It was Alessandro Moretti's usual table, positioned strategically so he could see anyone coming or going. Matteo climbed into the oversized chair, his feet dangling above the floor. Vincent checked his watch and frowned. "Your father should be here any minute. I'll wait by the door." But Grace, refilling water glasses at a nearby table, caught the flicker of doubt that crossed the little boy's face. She had seen that expression before, in her own mirror years ago, waiting for parents who worked too much and promised too little. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Matteo sat perfectly still, his small hands folded in his lap, watching the door with the patience of a child who had learned not to expect too much. Other diners began to notice the boy sitting alone, whispering behind their hands about the Moretti Air dining solo. Grace approached the table carefully, her training warring with an instinct she couldn't quite name. "Would you like something to drink while you wait?" she asked gently. Matteo looked up at her with eyes that seemed far too serious for a 7-year-old. "Chocolate milk," he said quietly. "If you have it. I'll see what I can do," Grace smiled. And for just a moment, Matteo's rigid posture relaxed slightly. She returned with a tall glass of chocolate milk, complete with a striped straw and a small plate of cookies she had convinced the kitchen to spare. "The cookies are on the house," she said, setting them down carefully. "Thank you," Matteo said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was perhaps the first genuine kindness he had received all day. Another 20 minutes crawled by. The chocolate milk sat untouched, and the cookies remained on their plate. Mateo continued his vigil, watching the door with the desperate hope of a child who still believed his father might appear. At 8:15, Vincent's phone buzzed. He answered with a sharp, "Yeah," then listened, his expression growing grim. He approached Mateo's table with obvious reluctance. "Young master," he said carefully, "your father has been delayed. Business emergency. He sends his apologies." The words hit Mateo like a physical blow. His small face crumpled for just a moment before he forced it back into careful neutrality. But Grace, watching from across the room, saw the exact moment the little boy's heart broke. "I want to go home," Mateo said quietly. "Your father requested you finish your dinner first," Vincent replied, clearly uncomfortable with the lie. "He's very sorry." That's when something inside Mateo snapped. The chocolate milk glass flew first, shattering against the wall in an explosion of brown liquid and crystal shards. Then came the plate of cookies, followed by the silverware, each piece clattering to the floor with increasing violence. "I hate him," Mateo screamed, his 7-year-old voice carrying across the suddenly silent restaurant. "He promised. He always promises." Diners turned to stare, some reaching for their phones to record the meltdown of the mafia prince. Vincent moved forward, but Mateo was beyond reason now, months of abandonment and confusion pouring out in a torrent of rage and tears. He grabbed the tablecloth and yanked, sending water glasses, bread plates, and silverware crashing to the marble floor. The sound was deafening in the elegant space, and several patrons began to leave, unwilling to witness the spectacle. "Nobody cares," Mateo sobbed, kicking at the fallen chairs. "Mommy left and Daddy doesn't want me." The words cut through the chaos like a knife. This wasn't just a tantrum. This was the raw, desperate cry of a child who felt utterly abandoned by the two people who were supposed to love him most. Vincent tried to approach again, but Mateo threw a dinner roll at him, his small face red with tears and fury. The maitre d' hovered nearby, clearly torn between protecting his restaurant and avoiding the wrath of Alessandro Moretti. And then, through the chaos, Grace moved. She didn't rush or shout commands. She simply walked calmly through the debris field, her soft-soled shoes crunching quietly on broken glass. She knelt down about 3 feet away from Mateo, close enough to reach him, but far enough to give him space. "I know your heart is hurting," she said softly, her voice somehow carrying over his sobs. Mateo froze mid-throw, a breadstick still clutched in his small fist. He stared at her through tear-blurred eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe someone had actually spoken to him instead of about him. "Sometimes when our hearts hurt really bad," Grace continued in the same gentle tone, "we want to break things because we feel broken inside." Mateo's breathing began to slow, his chest still heaving with leftover sobs. The breadstick fell from his fingers. "But you know what I learned?" Grace asked, settling more comfortably on the floor among the broken dishes. "Breaking things doesn't fix the hurt. It just makes more broken pieces." "My daddy doesn't love me," Mateo whispered, the words barely audible. "Oh, sweetheart," Grace said, her heart breaking for this small lost boy. "Sometimes grown-ups are really bad at showing love. That doesn't mean they don't feel it." Mateo looked at her with those 2 old eyes, searching her face for lies. But Grace's expression was open and honest, free of the careful fear that colored everyone else's interactions with him. "Will you help me clean this up together?" Grace asked. For a long moment, Mateo just stared at her. Then slowly he nodded. As they began picking up the larger pieces of broken dishes, neither of them noticed the figure who had appeared in the restaurant's doorway. Alessandro Moretti, still in his business suit, watching his son kneel on the floor beside a waitress who had done what no one else could do. She had seen Mateo not as the dangerous heir to a criminal empire, but simply as a little boy who needed someone to care. Alessandro Alex Moretti stood in the doorway of Lumiere, his presence immediately shifting the atmosphere in the restaurant. At 42, he commanded attention without effort. 6 feet of controlled power in a perfectly tailored Armani suit, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, and eyes that could freeze blood or melt hearts depending on his mood. Tonight those eyes were fixed on his son, who was carefully placing broken pieces of china into Grace's outstretched hands. The other diners recognized him immediately. Conversations died mid-sentence, and several patrons suddenly found urgent reasons to leave. Alessandro Moretti wasn't just wealthy. He was dangerous. The kind of man whose name appeared in whispered conversations and FBI files. But right now, watching his 7-year-old son work alongside a young waitress to clean up the destruction he had caused, Alex felt something he rarely experienced. Uncertainty. Matteo looked up from where he knelt on the floor, his small face still streaked with tears. The hope in his voice was heartbreaking, as if he couldn't quite believe his father had actually come. Alex's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The scene before him was a stark reminder of his failures as a father, and Alessandro Moretti was not a man accustomed to failure. "Matteo," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "What happened here?" Grace rose gracefully from the floor, still holding pieces of broken glass. She could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way everyone seemed to hold their breath in the presence of this man. But when she looked at him, she saw something others missed, the way his hands clenched slightly at his sides, the almost imperceptible tension around his eyes when he looked at his son. "It was an accident," she said quietly, stepping slightly closer to Matteo in an unconsciously protective gesture. Alex's gaze shifted to her for the first time, really seeing her. Auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, green eyes that met his without flinching, an acquired strength that reminded him of someone he tried not to think about. She was beautiful in an understated way that had nothing to do with the artificial perfection he was used to seeing in his world. "An accident," he repeated, his tone unreadable. "Sometimes accidents happen when we're feeling big emotions," Grace continued, her hand resting gently on Matteo's shoulder. Matteo was just having a hard time. The simple honesty in her words hit Alex harder than he expected. When was the last time someone had spoken to him without fear or calculation? When was the last time someone had defended his son instead of just managing him? "I see," Alex said slowly. He looked around at the debris field. Overturned chairs, broken dishes, chocolate milk staining the white tablecloth. The damage was significant, but not irreparable, unlike other things in his life. Vincent approached cautiously. "Boss, I tried to." "It's fine." "Vincent," Alex cut him off, his eyes never leaving Matteo. "Wait in the car." As Vincent retreated, Alex moved closer to his son. Matteo instinctively stepped back, bumping into Grace's legs. She steadied him with gentle hands, and Alex noticed how naturally the boy leaned into her touch. "Are you hurt?" Alex asked, crouching down to Matteo's eye level. It was a simple question, but loaded with meaning neither of them was ready to address. Matteo shook his head, but his lower lip trembled slightly. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I didn't mean to break everything." The words cut through Alex's chest like a blade. His son was apologizing for having emotions, for reacting like any 7-year-old would when abandoned and disappointed. It was exactly what Alex himself had learned to do at that age. Apologize for feeling anything at all. "You don't need to apologize," Alex said quietly. And Grace was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "I should have been here." "You're here now," Matteo said hopefully. And Alex's expression tightened with something that looked like pain. "Yes," Alex agreed, though they both knew it wasn't enough. It was never enough. He stood, pulling out his phone to handle the practical matters, paying for damages, ensuring the restaurant's silence, managing the fallout. It was easier than dealing with the emotional wreckage that couldn't be fixed with money. "Mr. Moretti," the maitre d' approached nervously. "Please don't worry about the damages. These things happen." "I'll pay for everything." Alex cut him off, his voice returning to its usual commanding tone. "And for any lost business tonight. I trust this incident won't become a topic of conversation." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. The maitre d' nodded quickly. "Of course, sir, complete discretion." As Alex handled the business side of the disaster, Grace continued helping Matteo collect the smaller pieces of debris. She noticed how the little boy kept glancing at his father, as if afraid he might disappear again. "He came," Matteo whispered to her so quietly that only she could hear. "He actually came." "He did," Grace agreed, her heart aching for this child who was so grateful for the bare minimum of parental attention. "Miss," Alex's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her suddenly aware of how she must appear, kneeling on the floor in her simple black uniform, surrounded by the chaos his son had created. "O'Sullivan," she supplied. "Grace O'Sullivan." "Miss O'Sullivan," he continued, his accent carrying just a hint of his Italian heritage. I want to thank you for helping Mateo. There was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't used to thanking people, especially not for showing basic human kindness to his child. Any child would need help in this situation, Grace said simply. Mateo is a good kid. He was just overwhelmed. Alex studied her face, looking for signs of the fear or calculation he was used to seeing in people's eyes when they realized who he was. But Grace's expression remained steady, concerned only for the welfare of a distressed child. Would you join us for dinner? Alex found himself saying, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. Mateo's face immediately brightened. Please, he said, tugging on Grace's hand. I want to show you my drawings. I keep them in my backpack. Grace hesitated. She was still on shift, and getting more involved with the Moretti family seemed like a dangerous proposition. But looking at the little boy's eager face, she found herself weakening. Maybe sometime, she said carefully, if your father thinks it's appropriate. Please, Daddy. Mateo turned his full attention to Alex. She's nice, and she doesn't get scared when I'm upset. Alex studied his son's face, seeing hope there that had been absent for months. Then he looked at Grace, this young woman who had somehow reached his child when no one else could. We'll see, he said finally, and Mateo's face lit up as if he'd just been promised Christmas morning. As they finished dinner, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to make a decision that would change everything. But when Mateo slipped his small hand into hers as they prepared to leave, she realized it might already be too late to turn back. Some connections, she was beginning to understand, were stronger than common sense. 3 days after the restaurant incident, Grace was wiping down tables at the end of her shift when Henri approached with an envelope. This came for you, he said, his expression curious. Hand delivered by a man in a very expensive suit. Grace's heart skipped as she recognized the heavy cream paper with a Moretti embossed at the top. Inside was a brief note in elegant handwriting. Miss O'Sullivan, Mateo has asked about you every day since our dinner. If you're amenable, I would like to invite you to our home this Saturday afternoon. Mateo would very much like to show you his room as promised. A car will collect you at 2 p.m. if you accept. A. Moretti. Below the note was an address in the Hollywood Hills and a phone number. Grace stared at the invitation, her practical mind warring with something deeper. She should decline. Getting further involved with the Moretti family was dangerous on multiple levels, but the memory of Mateo's hopeful face kept intruding on her rational thoughts. Saturday afternoon found her sitting in the back of a black Mercedes, winding through the exclusive neighborhoods of the Hollywood Hills. The houses grew larger and more isolated as they climbed until finally they turned through imposing iron gates and up a long driveway. The Moretti mansion was breathtaking, a modern interpretation of Mediterranean architecture with clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered stunning views of Los Angeles below. It was beautiful, but also fortress-like, with security cameras and high walls that spoke of a family that lived with constant awareness of danger. Mateo burst through the front door before the car had fully stopped, his face bright with excitement. Grace, you came. I knew you would. He threw his arms around her waist, and Grace felt her heart melt a little more. Behind him, Alex appeared in the doorway, looking more relaxed than she had seen him at the restaurant. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, but somehow still managed to look intimidating. Welcome to our home, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there in the restaurant. Mateo grabbed Grace's hand. Come see my room, he said eagerly, pulling her toward a grand staircase. I have so many things to show you. As they climbed the stairs, Grace couldn't help but notice the subtle signs of wealth everywhere. Original artwork on the walls, marble floors that probably cost more than most people's houses. And yet there was something lonely about the space, too pristine, too perfect, like a museum rather than a home. Mateo's room was different. It was clearly lived in, with toys scattered on the floor, drawings taped to the walls, and an unmade bed that suggested a child actually slept there. Look, Mateo said, pulling out a folder from his desk. These are all my drawings. He spread them out carefully on the bed, and Grace's heart clenched as she looked at them. They were all of families. Stick figures holding hands, standing in front of houses with carefully drawn flowers and trees. But in every single drawing, there were only 2 figures. A tall one labeled Daddy, and a smaller one labeled me. This one's my favorite, Mateo said, pointing to a drawing that showed two figures standing in front of what was clearly meant to be the restaurant. Daddy came to find me when I was sad. It's beautiful, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. You're very talented. Mateo beamed and carefully pulled out another piece of paper. This one was different, unfinished. There were the same two figures, but there was a space between them, as if he'd started to draw a third figure but hadn't completed it. I'm working on this one, he said quietly. I'm trying to figure out who should go in the middle. Grace's throat constricted as she realized what she was looking at. This little boy was literally drawing his wish for a family, for someone who wouldn't leave him. It's a beautiful drawing, Grace managed, her voice slightly thick. You're a very talented artist. Mateo beamed and carefully folded the paper back up. I'm going to finish it when I figure out who the third person should be. The waiter appeared to take their order, and Alex found himself in the surreal position of ordering dinner for three, something he hadn't done since Sophia left. He watched Grace help Mateo decide between the chicken and the fish, patiently explaining the differences and letting him make his own choice. The chicken, please, Mateo announced to the waiter. With extra vegetables, because Grace says they make you strong. When did I say that? Grace asked, smiling. Just now with your eyes, Mateo said matter-of-factly, and Grace laughed again. Alex found himself studying that laugh, the way it changed her entire face. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was something genuine about her, something real in a world where he was surrounded by people who told him what they thought he wanted to hear. So, Miss O'Sullivan, he said as their appetizers arrived. What brought you to Los Angeles? Grace hesitated, cutting her salad carefully. Opportunity, I suppose. Better job prospects than Boston. It was a non-answer, and they both knew it. But Alex recognized the deflection. He used similar tactics himself when people asked too many questions about his business. And you work at Lumiere full-time. Among other places, Grace admitted. I also work at a coffee shop in the mornings and do some freelance bookkeeping on weekends. 3 jobs, Alex's eyebrows rose slightly. That's ambitious. That's survival, Grace corrected quietly, then seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, I have responsibilities back home. My grandmother needs care, and she trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with revealing too much personal information. Your grandmother raised you? Alex asked, his tone gentler now. Grace nodded. After my parents died when I was 12. She's everything to me. Mateo looked up from his bread roll. My mommy left, he announced matter-of-factly. Daddy says she had to go away, but I think she just didn't want to live with us anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex's face went carefully blank, and Grace could see the pain he was trying to hide. This was clearly not a topic they had discussed properly, and Mateo's casual acceptance of abandonment broke her heart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult choices, Grace said carefully, glancing at Alex. But that doesn't mean it's anyone's fault, especially not yours, Mateo. That's what Daddy says, too, Mateo replied. But there was doubt in his young voice. But if she loved me, wouldn't she have stayed? Alex's jaw tightened, and Grace felt her throat constrict with unexpected emotion. This little boy was literally drawing his wish for a family, for someone who wouldn't leave him. It's a beautiful drawing, Grace managed, her voice slightly thick. You're a very talented artist. Mateo beamed and carefully folded the paper back up. I'm going to finish it when I figure out who the third person should be. The waiter appeared to take their order, and Alex found himself in the surreal position of ordering dinner for 3, something he hadn't done since Sophia left. He watched Grace help Mateo decide between the chicken and the fish, patiently explaining the differences and letting him make his own choice. The chicken, please, Mateo announced to the waiter. With extra vegetables, because Grace says they make you strong. When did I say that? Grace asked, smiling. Just now with your eyes, Mateo said matter-of-factly, and Grace laughed again. Alex found himself studying that laugh, the way it changed her entire face. She was beautiful, but it was more than that. There was something genuine about her, something real in a world where he was surrounded by people who told him what they thought he wanted to hear. So, Miss O'Sullivan, he said as their appetizers arrived. What brought you to Los Angeles? Grace hesitated, cutting her salad carefully. Opportunity, I suppose. Better job prospects than Boston. It was a non-answer, and they both knew it. But Alex recognized the deflection. He used similar tactics himself when people asked too many questions about his business. And you work at Lumiere full-time. Among other places, Grace admitted. I also work at a coffee shop in the mornings and do some freelance bookkeeping on weekends. 3 jobs. Alex's eyebrows rose slightly. That's ambitious. That's survival, Grace corrected quietly, then seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, I have responsibilities back home. My grandmother needs care, and she trailed off, clearly uncomfortable with revealing too much personal information. Your grandmother raised you? Alex asked, his tone gentler now. Grace nodded. After my parents died when I was 12. She's everything to me. Mateo looked up from his bread roll. My mommy left, he announced matter-of-factly. Daddy says she had to go away, but I think she just didn't want to live with us anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Alex's face went carefully blank, and Grace could see the pain he was trying to hide. This was clearly not a topic they had discussed properly, and Mateo's casual acceptance of abandonment broke her heart. Sometimes grown-ups have to make very difficult choices, Grace said carefully, glancing at Alex. But that doesn't mean it's anyone's fault, especially not yours, Mateo. That's what Daddy says, too, Mateo replied. But there was doubt in his young voice. But if she loved me, wouldn't she have stayed? I learned early that love doesn't protect you from anything. It just gives you more to lose. The pieces clicked into place for Grace. Alex's emotional distance, his struggle with expressing affection, his terror of letting anyone get too close. It all stemmed from a 7-year-old boy who had been abandoned by the person who was supposed to protect him. You're not your father, she said firmly. How can you be sure? Because your father wouldn't be sitting in this hospital room at midnight, terrified that he'd failed his son. Your father wouldn't care enough to question his own choices. Mateo stirred in his sleep, mumbling something incoherent. Both adults immediately focused on him, but he settled back into peaceful slumber. He asked for you, Alex said quietly. When the school called when he was hurt, he asked for you. He asked for his father, too, Grace replied. You're the most important person in his world, Alex. Don't let your fear make you forget that. Alex stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the city lights. I can't promise you safety, he said without turning around. I can't promise you a normal life or a future without complications. Being part of our world means accepting risks that most people never have to consider. I'm not asking for promises, Grace said. I'm asking for honesty and for you to stop trying to make my choices for me. Alex turned back to face her, and in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen before. Hope, fragile and tentative, but real. You could walk away right now, he said. Mateo would be hurt, but he'd recover. You could go back to your safe life. Find someone who doesn't come with a target on his back. I could, Grace agreed. But I won't. Grace looked at Mateo, sleeping peacefully between them, then back at Alex. Because that little boy has already claimed a piece of my heart, and because his father is worth the risk. The silence that followed was charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. Finally, Alex moved back to his chair, reaching across the bed to take Grace's free hand. If you stay, he said quietly, you belong to us. Both of us, and we protect what's ours. Is that a threat or a promise? Grace asked. Both, Alex replied, his thumb tracing across her knuckles. In my world, they're often the same thing. As dawn broke over Los Angeles, painting the hospital room in soft golden light, Grace made her choice. She squeezed Alex's hand and settled back in her chair, ready to face whatever came next. She was part of their family now, for better or worse, and looking at the 2 Moretti men who had claimed her heart, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Some risks she was learning were worth taking. Years later, the sound of laughter echoed through the garden of the Moretti mansion as Mateo, now 10 years old, chased his younger sister around the rose bushes. At 3, Elena Moretti was a perfect combination of her parents, her father's dark eyes, and determined chin. And when I said we wanted it to be a surprise, he said he hoped it would be a boy so he could teach him how to be brave like his daddy. Alex's arm tightened around her. And if it's a girl, then he'll teach her how to be strong like her mama, Grace finished with a smile. Either way, he's already planning to be the best big brother in the world. Alex was quiet for a moment, processing the weight of his son's words. He thinks I'm brave. He thinks you're a hero, Grace corrected gently. The man who protects his family and keeps them safe. The father who shows up to every school play and soccer game. Who helps with homework and reads bedtime stories. That's the man he sees when he looks at you. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real. Alex admitted that I get to have this. A family who loves me. Children who aren't afraid of me. A wife who sees the best in me, even when I can't see it myself. Believe it, Grace said, placing her hand over his heart. This is your life now. Our life, and it's only going to get better. From down the hall came the sound of little feet padding across the floor, followed by Mateo's voice calling softly, "Mama, Daddy." Elena had a bad dream. They found both children in Elena's room. Mateo sitting on the edge of her toddler bed, gently patting her back while she sniffled into her stuffed elephant. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Grace asked, settling carefully on the other side of the bed. "Scary monster," Elena whispered. "In the closet." "Well, we can't have that," Alex said seriously, moving to the closet and opening the door wide. "Let's see. No monsters in here, just clothes and toys." "Maybe it's hiding," Elena said uncertainly. "You know what?" Mateo said importantly. "Monsters are afraid of families that love each other. Daddy told me that once. As long as we're all together, no monsters can get us." "Is that true, Daddy?" Elena asked. Alex knelt beside the bed, his expression solemn. "Absolutely true. Love is the strongest magic there is, and this family has more love than any monster could handle." Elena seemed satisfied with this explanation, curling up under her covers with her elephant clutched tightly. "Will you stay until I fall asleep?" "Of course," Grace said, settling into the rocking chair beside the bed. "Mateo, do you want to help me sing the lullaby?" As their voices blended together in the soft Italian lullaby that Alex had taught them, Elena's eyes grew heavy. Mateo held her hand, and Alex stood guard by the window, watching over all of them. It was a scene that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. Alessandro Moretti, feared by enemies and respected by allies, singing lullabies to his children while his pregnant wife rocked gently beside their daughter's bed. But this was what love had done to him, what family had made possible. When Elena was finally asleep, they tucked Mateo back into his own bed, where he proudly showed them the latest addition to his drawing collection, the same stick figure family he had drawn years ago, but now complete. The third figure was clearly Grace with long hair and a big smile, standing between him and his father. And now there were two more figures, a smaller girl with curly hair and another tiny figure that he had labeled Baby. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, kissing his forehead. "Just like our family." "I love you, Mama," Mateo said sleepily. "I love you, Papa. Thank you for making our family complete." As they turned off the lights and closed his door, Alex caught Grace's hand in the hallway. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing him that night in the restaurant. For staying when you should have run. For loving us when we didn't know how to love ourselves." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "For making me a better man than I ever thought I could be." "You did that yourself," Grace said, reaching up to cup his face. "I just reminded you who you already were underneath all that fear." "I love you," Alex said, the words still carrying the wonder of someone who had never expected to say them and mean them completely. "I love you too," Grace replied. "All of you forever." As they walked back to their bedroom, past the rooms where their children slept safely, Grace thought about that night 3 years ago, when a little boy had broken dishes and her heart in equal measure. She had made a choice then to see past the chaos to the pain underneath, to offer kindness instead of judgment. That choice had led to this, a love deeper than she had ever imagined possible, a family that had healed each other's wounds, and a future bright with promise. Sometimes, she reflected, the most dangerous risks led to the most beautiful rewards, and sometimes all it took to change everything was one person willing to kneel down beside a broken child and whisper, "I know your heart is hurting." In the end, that was all any of them had ever needed. Someone to see their pain, to stay through the storm, and to believe that love was stronger than fear. They had found that in each other, and it had made all the difference. But their story was far from over. What they had built in those early years would soon be tested in ways they never could have imagined. Love, they would learn, was not just about the quiet moments of connection, but about standing together when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. 6 months after Elena's 3rd birthday, Grace stood in the kitchen of their Hollywood Hills home, her hands trembling as she read the letter that had arrived with the morning mail. The return address was one she recognized, one that made her stomach clench with a mixture of hope and dread. Boston General Hospital, her grandmother's doctor. Alex found her there 20 minutes later, still clutching the letter, tears streaming down her face. The coffee pot had overflowed, filling the kitchen with the bitter scent of burnt coffee, but Grace hadn't noticed. She was lost in a world where time had suddenly become the most precious commodity she had never learned to treasure. "What is it?" Alex asked gently, crossing the kitchen to pull her into his arms. Grace couldn't speak for a moment, could only lean into the solid warmth of his chest and try to find the words that would make this real. "It's my grandmother," she finally whispered. "The cancer has spread. They're saying weeks, maybe a month. The doctor wants to know if there's anyone who should be contacted, anyone who might want to say goodbye." Alex's arms tightened around her, and she could feel the tension in his body as he processed what this meant. Grace's grandmother wasn't just her family. She was the woman who had raised her, who had sacrificed everything to give Grace the education and opportunities that had eventually led her to Los Angeles, to Mateo, to this life they had built together. "We leave tonight," Alex said without hesitation. "I'll have Vincent arrange the jet." Grace pulled back to look at him, surprised by the certainty in his voice. "Alex, you can't just leave. Your business, the meetings this week, the contract negotiations. None of that matters." Alex cut her off firmly. "Family matters. Your grandmother matters. We go to Boston, and we stay as long as you need to stay." It was a side of Alessandro Moretti that the business world rarely saw, but Grace had learned to recognize it in the years they had been together. Beneath the calculated exterior of a man who controlled an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars was someone who understood that love meant showing up, especially when showing up was difficult. The flight to Boston was a study in contrasts. In the luxurious cabin of Alex's private jet, Mateo colored quietly in a sketchbook while Elena napped in Grace's arms. But Grace could see the tension in Alex's shoulders, the way his eyes constantly moved to the windows, as if he could somehow make the plane fly faster through sheer force of will. He had insisted they bring the children, understanding instinctively that Grace needed her whole family with her for this. It was a risk, taking Mateo and Elena so far from the security of their controlled environment in Los Angeles. But Alex had made the calculation that Grace's emotional well-being was worth any potential complications. "What if she doesn't remember me?" Grace said quietly as the plane began its descent into Logan Airport. It had been almost 4 years since she had seen her grandmother in person, communicating instead through phone calls and video chats that had become increasingly infrequent as the older woman's health declined. "She'll remember you," Alex said with quiet confidence. "You don't forget someone who loves you that completely." And Mateo pressed against Grace's other side, looking up at her with those dark eyes that seemed to understand far more than a 10-year-old should. "Is great-grandmother very sick?" he asked. Grace nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "Will she get better?" Elena asked, her voice small and confused. "Sometimes people get so sick that their bodies can't get better," Grace explained carefully. "But that doesn't mean they stop loving us, or that we stop loving them. Love doesn't end just because someone has to go away." The nursing home in Boston was nothing like the sterile medical facilities Grace had imagined. Sunrise Manor was warm and welcoming, with comfortable sitting areas and gardens where residents could spend time with their families. But Grace's heart still clenched when she saw her grandmother for the first time in 4 years. Margaret O'Sullivan had always been a formidable woman, the kind of Irish matriarch who ran her household with love and an iron will in equal measure. But illness had diminished her in ways that no amount of preparation could have cushioned. She seemed smaller somehow, fragile in a way that made Grace want to wrap her in blankets and somehow will her back to the strong, vital woman who had raised her. But when Margaret's eyes focused on Grace's face, the recognition was immediate and complete. "Grace Elizabeth O'Sullivan," she said, her voice still carrying traces of the Cork accent that 60 years in Boston hadn't quite erased. "You're more beautiful than ever, sweetheart. And who are these fine people you've brought to meet your old grandmother?" Grace made the introductions with a voice thick with emotion. "Grandmother, this is Alessandro, my husband. And these are our children, Mateo and Elena." Alex stepped forward with the kind of formal respect that Grace had never seen him show anyone else, taking Margaret's frail hand in both of his. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said, his own voice carrying unexpected emotion. "Grace has told me so much about you. I want you to know how grateful I am for everything you did to raise such an extraordinary woman." Margaret studied Alex's face with the sharp intelligence that illness hadn't dimmed. "You're the one," she said after a moment. "The one who helped my Grace find her family." She squeezed his hands with surprising strength. "Thank you for loving her the way she deserves to be loved." Mateo approached the bed with characteristic directness, climbing onto the chair beside it so he could be at eye level with Margaret. "Are you really Grace's grandmother?" he asked. "She talks about you all the time. She says you taught her how to be strong." "I did my best," Margaret replied with a smile that transformed her entire face. "But I think your mama was born strong. I just try not to get in the way of it." Elena was more cautious, hanging back until Margaret patted the bed beside her. "Come here, little one. Let me look at you properly." With Grace's encouragement, Elena climbed up onto the bed, immediately fascinated by the silver locket Margaret wore around her neck. "This was my mother's," Margaret explained, opening the locket to reveal two tiny photographs. "And someday, it will be your mama's, and maybe someday after that, it will be yours." The next 2 weeks passed in a rhythm of hospital visits, quiet family dinners, and long conversations that stretched late into the night. Alex had arranged for them to stay in a suite at the Four Seasons, but they spent most of their time at Sunrise Manor, where Margaret seemed to gain strength from having her family around her. Grace watched her husband navigate this unfamiliar territory with a grace that continually surprised her. Alex was used to controlling situations, to having the resources and influence to fix whatever problems arose. But this was something that couldn't be bought or negotiated or threatened into submission. This was about being present, about listening, about finding ways to show love in the face of powerlessness. He brought Margaret flowers every day, not the elaborate arrangements that his money could have purchased, but simple bouquets from the farmer's market that reminded her of the gardens she had tended in Ireland as a girl. He listened to her stories about Grace's childhood with the focused attention he usually reserved for business negotiations, asking questions that showed he understood how precious these memories were. And when Margaret asked him about his own childhood, Alex answered with an honesty that Grace had rarely heard him display. He told her about growing up in a world where affection was a luxury and survival was never guaranteed, about learning to build walls around his heart that Grace had somehow managed to breach. "You were just a little boy," Margaret said after Alex finished describing his father's death when he was barely older than Mateo was now. "No child should have to grow up that fast, should have to carry that kind of responsibility." "I survived," Alex said simply. "And eventually, I found Grace. So maybe all of it was worth it." Margaret reached out to touch his face with hands that shook but were still gentle. "You did more than survive," she said firmly. "You learned how to love, despite everything that tried to teach you not to. That takes a kind of courage most people never find." It was Mateo who seemed to understand best what was happening. While Elena played with her toys and chattered happily about the new people she was meeting, Mateo spent his time drawing pictures for Margaret and asking the kind of direct questions that adults often avoided. "Are you scared?" he asked one afternoon as they sat together in the garden. Margaret considered the question seriously, understanding that Mateo deserved an honest answer. "A little," she admitted, "but not of dying. I'm scared of leaving your mama when she still needs me. I'm scared of not getting to see you and Elena grow up, not getting to hear about all the wonderful things you're going to do." Mateo nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Grace says you taught her how to be strong," he said. "So maybe you don't have to worry, because she can teach Elena and me. And then we can teach our children, and it will be like you're still helping us even when you're not here." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "You're a wise boy, Mateo. Your great-grandmother would have loved you very much." As Margaret's condition worsened, the difficult decisions began to multiply. Grace found herself torn between wanting to stay by her grandmother's side and knowing that Mateo and Elena needed some sense of normalcy. It was Alex who suggested a solution that none of them had considered. "What if we brought her home?" he said one evening as they sat in their hotel suite. "Our home, to Los Angeles. I can have a medical team set up in the guest wing, around-the-clock nursing, whatever she needs. She could spend her remaining time with all of us, where Mateo and Elena could see her every day." Grace stared at him, overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer. "Alex, that would be incredibly expensive, incredibly complicated. The medical equipment alone, the staff, the liability." "I don't care about the money," Alex said simply. "And complicated is what I do. If she's willing, If her doctors think it's safe for her to travel, then we bring her home. She should be surrounded by family, not stuck in a hospital room. When Grace broached the subject with Margaret the next day, the older woman was quiet for a long time. Grace held her breath, understanding that this was asking a lot from someone who had spent her entire life in Boston, who had never traveled further west than New York. "I've never seen California," Margaret finally said, "and I'd like to meet the rest of your family, the people who help you take care of my babies. If Alessandro thinks he can manage it, then I think I'd like to see the home where my Grace has been so happy." The logistics of moving a terminally ill woman across the country were staggering, but Alex approached them with the same focused efficiency he brought to his business dealings. Within 72 hours, he had assembled a medical team, arranged for a specially equipped medical transport, and had the guest wing of their home converted into a state-of-the-art care facility. Grace watched him coordinate these arrangements with a mixture of awe and love. This was her husband at his most formidable, using every resource at his disposal not for profit or power, but for the simple purpose of making sure an elderly woman could spend her last days surrounded by the family she had sacrificed everything to protect. The flight back to Los Angeles was tense, with Margaret's condition fragile enough that every hour felt precious. But she was alert and comfortable, holding Grace's hand and marveling at the view from the plane's windows as they flew over the country she had never had the opportunity to see. When they arrived at the Moretti mansion, Margaret was overwhelmed by the sight of the home her granddaughter had described in phone calls and video chats. But it was the garden that truly captured her attention, the carefully tended roses and flowering trees that reminded her of the estate gardens she had admired as a girl in Ireland. "It's beautiful," she whispered as Alex helped her into the wheelchair they would need for the next few weeks. "You've built something beautiful here." The final month of Margaret's life was both heartbreaking and precious in ways Grace had never expected. Having her grandmother in their home changed the rhythm of their daily lives, but in ways that felt natural rather than intrusive. Margaret became the center around which the family's activities revolved, with Matteo and Elena spending their afternoons in her room, listening to stories about their mother's childhood and their Irish heritage. Alex surprised everyone, perhaps most of all himself, by how naturally he took to caring for Margaret. Grace would often find him in the garden with her, reading aloud from the Irish poetry she loved, or simply sitting in comfortable silence as they watched Matteo and Elena play on the lawn. "She's proud of you," Margaret told Alex one afternoon as they watched Grace help Elena with her homework. "You know that, don't you? What you've built here, the family you've created, the man you've become. She sees all of it, and she's proud." Alex was quiet for a moment, considering words that he had never expected to hear from anyone. "My own family never had the chance to be proud of anything," he said finally. "I spent so many years thinking that was just how families worked, that love was something you earned through accomplishment rather than something you were simply given." "Grace gave you something different," Margaret observed, "but you had to be ready to receive it. That took courage, Alessandro. Don't underestimate what you brought to this relationship." It was during one of these garden conversations that Margaret asked Alex the question he had been dreading. "When I'm gone," she said without preamble, "Grace is going to blame herself. She's going to think she should have done more, should have somehow found a way to save me. You can't let her carry that burden." Alex nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility Margaret was placing on his shoulders. "She's stronger than she thinks she is," he said. "But she's also more tender-hearted than she wants anyone to know." "Exactly," Margaret replied. "So you'll need to remind her that love isn't about preventing loss. It's about being present for the love that's possible, for as long as it's possible. Can you do that for me?" "I promise," Alex said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Margaret O'Sullivan died on a Thursday morning in early spring, with Grace holding one hand and Elena curled up beside her, chattering about the flowers they had picked from the garden the day before. It was peaceful as such moments can be, and Grace was grateful beyond words that her grandmother had been surrounded by love rather than the sterile efficiency of a hospital. The funeral was held at St. Brendan's Catholic Church in Los Angeles, with Father Murphy delivering a eulogy that captured both Margaret's fierce independence and her absolute devotion to her family. The church was filled with people Grace had never met, neighbors and fellow residents from Sunrise Manor who had made the trip to California, because Margaret had become important to them in the brief time they had known her. But it was Alex's eulogy that broke Grace's heart and put it back together again in the same breath. He spoke about Margaret with the kind of reverence usually reserved for saints, describing her as the woman who had raised the love of his life and taught her how to see the best in people, even when those people couldn't see it in themselves. "She accepted me into her family without question," Alex said, his voice steady despite the emotion Grace could see in his eyes. She looked at a man who had spent his life building walls and somehow saw someone worthy of her granddaughter's love. That kind of faith changes you. It makes you want to become the person she believed you already were. In the weeks following Margaret's death, Grace struggled with a grief that felt bottomless. Alex watched her try to push through it with the same determination she had always brought to challenges, throwing herself into caring for Mateo and Elena with an intensity that worried him. It was Mateo who finally broke through Grace's careful composure. He found her one evening in Margaret's room, which they had left largely unchanged since her death, sitting in the chair where Margaret had spent her afternoons reading. "Are you sad because great-grandmother died? Or because you think you should have saved her?" Mateo asked with the directness that characterized all his interactions. Grace looked at her son, surprised by the perceptiveness of his question. "Both," she admitted. "I know in my head that there was nothing I could do, but in my heart, I keep thinking that I should have tried harder, should have found some way to give her more time." Mateo climbed into the chair beside her, settling against her side with the easy affection that never failed to comfort her. "Do you remember when Elena was scared of monsters in her closet?" he asked. Grace nodded, not sure where this conversation was leading. "And you told her that love was the strongest magic there is, that as long as we loved her, no monsters could hurt her." Mateo looked up at Grace with Alex's dark eyes, but with a gentleness that was entirely his own. "Maybe that's what you did for great-grandmother. Maybe you loved her so much that the scary parts of dying couldn't hurt her." Grace felt tears start to fall, but for the first time since Margaret's death, they felt healing rather than simply painful. "You're very wise," she told her son. "How did you get to be so wise?" "I had good teachers," Mateo replied simply. "Great-grandmother, and you and Papa." He snuggled closer to Grace. "She's not really gone, you know. She's in the stories you tell us about when you were little, and in the way you make cookies just like she did, and in how you always know exactly what to say when Elena or I are scared." That night, Grace told Alex about her conversation with Mateo, marveling at their son's ability to find wisdom in the midst of grief. Alex listened with the careful attention he had learned to give to the things that mattered most to his family. "He's right. You know," Alex said when Grace finished, "about Margaret still being here. She's in every choice you make as a mother, every kindness you show to strangers, every moment when you choose love over fear. That's a kind of immortality most people never achieve." Grace leaned against Alex's chest, finally allowing herself to feel the full weight of her loss without trying to manage or control it. For the first time since Margaret's death, she let herself cry until there were no tears left, secure in the knowledge that Alex would hold her together until she was ready to be strong again. The months that followed Margaret's death brought changes none of them had expected. Grace found herself drawn to volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, using the communication skills she had developed in her academic career to help families navigate the complexities of childhood illness. It was demanding work, often heartbreaking, but it gave her a sense of purpose that felt like a continuation of Margaret's legacy of caring for others. Alex supported this new direction without question, understanding that Grace needed to channel her grief into something constructive. He arranged for additional security to accompany her to the hospital, but did so quietly, allowing Grace the independence she needed while ensuring her safety. It was through her hospital work that Grace met Dr. Sarah Chun, a pediatric oncologist whose direct communication style and fierce advocacy for her patients reminded Grace of Margaret in many ways. Sarah became Grace's first real friend in Los Angeles, someone who understood both the privilege and the isolation that came with being married to a man like Alessandro Moretti. "You're different from what I expected," Sarah told Grace one afternoon as they shared coffee in the hospital cafeteria. "Most of the wealthy wives who volunteer here last about 6 weeks before they realize that actual hospital work involves bodily fluids and genuine emotional investment." Grace laughed. recognizing the compliment hidden in Sarah's blunt assessment. "I wasn't always wealthy," she said, "and I learned early that real work, meaningful work, is one of the few things that can make loss bearable." It was Sarah who suggested that Grace consider returning to school, possibly pursuing a doctorate in clinical psychology with a focus on family therapy. "You have natural instincts for this kind of work," she said, "and the background in languages and cultural studies would be invaluable for working with diverse populations." The idea took root slowly, but once Grace began to seriously consider it, she found herself excited about the possibility of formal training in the field she had discovered through her volunteer work. When she broached the subject with Alex, his response was immediate and wholehearted support. "Do it," he said without hesitation. "Whatever you need, whatever resources, whatever schedule accommodations. If this is what you want to do, then we make it happen." "But what about Mateo and Elena?" Grace protested. "The time commitment, the studying, the clinical hours. I can't ask you to take on more responsibility for the children when you already carry so much." Alex stopped her with a look that was part amusement and part exasperation. "Grace," he said gently, "you seem to be forgetting that I'm already madly in love with my children and would probably spend more time with them if you'd let me. This isn't a burden you're asking me to take on. This is an opportunity you're giving me to be the kind of father I want to be." The conversation that followed was one of the most important of their marriage, a negotiation not just of practical logistics, but of the fundamental question of how they wanted to shape their family's future. Alex had spent years building financial security that would allow their children opportunities he had never had. But Grace's return to school represented something different, a commitment to service and intellectual growth that would model for Mateo and Elena a different kind of success. They enrolled Grace in the doctoral program at UCLA, a decision that required careful coordination with Alex's security team, but that allowed her to pursue her studies while maintaining their family's routine. The first year was challenging in ways Grace had not anticipated, not because of the academic work, which she found engaging and familiar, but because of the strange looks and whispered conversations that followed her around campus. Being Alessandro Moretti's wife, she discovered, carried a social weight that extended even into academic settings. Some professors treated her with a deference that had nothing to do with her scholarly abilities, while some classmates maintained a careful distance that spoke to their discomfort with her family's reputation. It was Mateo who helped Grace find her perspective on these challenges. He was now 11, old enough to understand that his family was different from those of his classmates, old enough to have overheard conversations about his father's business dealings that he wasn't supposed to understand. "Does it bother you?" he asked one evening as Grace helped him with his homework, "when people treat you differently because you're married to Papa?" "Sometimes," Grace admitted. "I want people to judge me based on my work, my ideas, my contributions. But some people can't see past who I'm married to." Mateo considered this with the seriousness he brought to all complex problems. "But you know who you are, right?" he said. "And Papa knows, and Elena and I know. So maybe what strangers think doesn't matter as much as what family thinks." Grace smiled at her son's ability to distill complicated emotional situations into their essential components. "When did you get so wise about people?" she asked. "I watch Papa," Mateo replied matter-of-factly. "He has to deal with people judging him all the time, but he doesn't let it change what he does or how he treats us. I figured maybe that's what grown-ups do when people don't understand them." It was this conversation that helped Grace approach her doctoral studies with a confidence that had nothing to do with other people's expectations and everything to do with her own sense of purpose. She threw herself into her coursework with the same intensity she had once brought to supporting Margaret, discovering a passion for family systems therapy that felt like a natural extension of everything she had learned about love, loss, and resilience. Her doctoral dissertation focused on the impact of trauma on family attachment patterns, drawing on research but also on the intimate knowledge she had gained from watching Alex heal from his childhood wounds and helping Mateo process his early experiences of abandonment. It was deeply personal work disguised as academic research, and it earned her recognition from professors who had initially been skeptical of her motivations for returning to school. The day Grace successfully defended her dissertation, Alex was there in the audience with Mateo and Elena, all of them dressed in their finest clothes as if they were attending a wedding or graduation ceremony. Which, in a way, they were. Grace had earned not just an academic degree, but a new understanding of herself as someone capable of growth and transformation even in the midst of building a family and maintaining a marriage. Dr. Grace O'Sullivan Moretti, Alex said that evening as they celebrated at their favorite restaurant. "I like the sound of that. It feels strange," Grace admitted. "Like I'm someone I never expected to become." "You're someone who was always there," Alex replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You just needed the right circumstances to let her emerge." As Grace began her clinical practice, working with families dealing with crisis and transition, she found that her unusual background became an asset rather than a liability. Parents who were struggling with children's behavioral problems or couples navigating marital difficulties often found it easier to trust someone who clearly understood that families came in many forms and that love could survive even the most challenging circumstances. Her first major case involved a family whose 7-year-old son had been acting out violently since his father's imprisonment for white-collar crimes. The mother, desperate and exhausted, had tried everything from medication to behavior modification programs without success. Grace recognized something familiar in the little boy's rage, something that reminded her of Mateo's meltdown in the restaurant all those years ago. This was a child who felt abandoned and powerless, who was using anger as a shield against feelings too big for his small body to contain. "Sometimes when our hearts hurt really bad," Grace told the boy during their second session, "we want to break things because we feel broken inside. But breaking things doesn't fix the hurt. It just makes more broken pieces." The little boy stared at her for a long moment, then burst into tears for the first time since his father's arrest. "My daddy's not coming home," he sobbed. "And everyone says it's not my fault. But if I was better, maybe he wouldn't have done bad things." Grace spent the next hour helping the child understand that parents make their own choices, that love doesn't prevent bad decisions, and that being angry was normal and acceptable as long as he found safe ways to express it. It was the beginning of a therapeutic relationship that would span several months, but it was also a confirmation for Grace that her academic training and her personal experiences had combined to give her something valuable to offer families in crisis. Word of Grace's work spread through the close-knit community of Los Angeles mental health professionals, and soon she was receiving referrals for some of the most challenging cases in the area. Families dealing with addiction, domestic violence, childhood trauma, and loss began seeking her out, drawn by her reputation for understanding complicated family dynamics without judgment. It was gratifying work, but also emotionally demanding in ways that Grace had not fully anticipated. She found herself carrying her clients' stories home with her, lying awake at night thinking about children who reminded her of Mateo or marriages that echoed the struggles she and Alex had navigated in their early years together. Alex noticed the change in Grace's demeanor before she did, the way she seemed more distant during dinner conversations, more preoccupied when they were spending time with Mateo and Elena. Rather than addressing it directly, he began making subtle adjustments to their family routine, taking on more of the evening responsibilities with the children so that Grace could have time to decompress from her clinical work. It was Elena who finally called Grace's attention to her own emotional state. At 6 years old, Elena had inherited her father's observational skills and her mother's directness, a combination that made her remarkably perceptive about the emotional undercurrents in their household. "Mama," Elena said one evening as Grace tucked her into bed, "are you sad because of the people you help at work?" Grace paused, recognizing that Elena deserved an honest answer, but struggling to find age-appropriate language for the complexity of her feelings. "Sometimes the people I work with have very hard problems," she said finally, "and it makes me sad to know that some children and families are struggling." "But you help them feel better, right?" Elena asked. "So maybe you should feel happy instead of sad." Grace smiled at her daughter's logical approach to emotional regulation. "You're right, sweetheart. I do help them, and that should make me happy. Sometimes grown-ups forget to notice the good parts when they're thinking too hard about the hard parts." "Maybe you could ask Papa to remind you about the good parts," Elena suggested. "He's really good at remembering important things." That night, Grace told Alex about her conversation with Elena, marveling at their daughter's emotional intelligence and practical wisdom. Alex listened with the focused attention he had learned to give to family matters, understanding that Grace was struggling with the balance between her professional calling and her emotional well-being. You care too much to do this work halfway, Alex observed. It's one of the things I love most about you, but it's also something we need to manage so it doesn't consume you. How do you manage it? Grace asked. When you're dealing with business problems that could affect our family's security, when you're making decisions that have consequences for dozens of employees. How do you care enough to do the work well without carrying it all home with you? Alex was quiet for a moment, considering a question he had never articulated for himself. I think about what I'm protecting, he said finally. When I'm in a difficult negotiation or dealing with a crisis, I remind myself that the goal isn't just to win or to maintain control. The goal is to create stability and security for you and Mateo and Elena. That gives me perspective on what matters and what doesn't. Grace nodded, understanding that Alex was offering her a framework for managing her own professional challenges. Maybe I need to remember that my goal isn't to save every family I work with, she said slowly. Maybe my goal is to give them tools and insights that help them save themselves. Exactly, Alex agreed. You can't take responsibility for other people's choices or other people's healing. But you can take responsibility for showing up fully, for bringing your best skills and insights to the work, and for maintaining your own emotional health so you can continue to be present for our family. This conversation marked a turning point in Grace's approach to her clinical practice. She began setting clearer boundaries between her professional and personal life, developing routines that helped her transition from the emotional intensity of her work to the different kind of intensity that came with being a mother and wife. She also began incorporating more of her own story into her work with families, sharing carefully chosen details about Mateo's early struggles and their family's journey toward healing. It was a risk, revealing personal information in a professional context, but Grace found that her clients responded to the authenticity of someone who had lived through family crisis and emerged stronger. One of her most challenging cases involved a teenage girl whose father had been killed in gang violence, leaving behind a family structure that had completely collapsed. The girl's mother had retreated into depression, her younger siblings were acting out in school, and the family was facing eviction from their apartment. Grace spent months working with this family, helping them process their grief while also connecting them with practical resources for housing, financial assistance, and educational support. It was the kind of comprehensive intervention that required coordination with social services, schools, and community organizations, but it was also exactly the kind of work that Grace felt called to do. When the family finally achieved stability, with the mother returning to work and the children's academic performance improving, the teenage daughter asked Grace a question that stayed with her for years afterward. "Why did you care so much about what happened to us?" the girl asked. "You don't know us, and your own family has everything they need. Why did it matter to you whether we made it or not?" Grace considered the question carefully, understanding that her answer would shape this young woman's understanding of how the world worked, whether people could be trusted to care about each other across lines of class and circumstance. "Because someone once cared about me that way," Grace said finally. "When I was not much older than you are now, I lost my parents and thought my world was ending. But my grandmother took me in and loved me and made sacrifices so I could have opportunities she never had. I learned that families aren't just about blood relations. They're about people who choose to stay and fight for each other, even when it's hard." The girl nodded slowly, processing this information with the seriousness it deserved. "So now you do that for other people," she said. "You choose to stay and fight for families who need someone to believe in them." "That's exactly right," Grace replied. "And someday, when you're older and stronger and have built the life you want to build, maybe you'll choose to do the same thing for someone else who needs it." It was conversations like these that reminded Grace why she had chosen this work, why the emotional demands were worth the impact she could have on families who had exhausted other resources. Her practice grew steadily, but she was careful to maintain a caseload that allowed her to give each family the attention they deserved while still being present for her own children and marriage. As Mateo entered his teenage years and Elena began elementary school, Grace found herself grateful for the perspective her professional work gave her on the normal challenges of parenting. Watching other families navigate adolescent rebellion, academic pressure, and social dynamics helped her approach her own children's growing independence with less anxiety and more confidence. Mateo, now 13, had inherited his father's intensity and his mother's analytical mind, a combination that made him both academically gifted and socially complicated. He was fiercely protective of Elena, almost parental in his concern for her well-being. But he also struggled with the weight of being Alessandro Moretti's son in environments where that name carried complicated associations. It was Grace who suggested that Matteo might benefit from individual therapy, not because he was struggling with serious emotional problems, but because he needed someone outside the family to help him process the unique challenges of his position. Alex was initially resistant to the idea, uncomfortable with the notion of sharing family business with an outsider, but Grace helped him understand that Matteo needed support in developing his own identity separate from his father's reputation. Dr. James Rodriguez, the therapist Grace found for Matteo, was a specialist in working with adolescents from high-profile families. He understood the particular pressures that came with wealth and notoriety, but he also had a gift for helping young people develop authentic self-worth that wasn't dependent on external validation or family legacy. Under Dr. Rodriguez's guidance, Matteo began exploring his own interests and talents, discovering a passion for photography that allowed him to observe and document the world around him without being the center of attention. His photos captured moments of genuine emotion and beauty, revealing an artistic sensibility that surprised everyone, including Matteo himself. "I never knew I was good at anything that wasn't about being Papa's son," Matteo told Grace one afternoon as they reviewed his latest portfolio. "All my life, people have seen me as a continuation of him, but these pictures are just mine." Grace felt a surge of pride and relief at her son's growing confidence in his own abilities. "That's what growing up is," she told him. "Learning to see yourself as the person you're becoming, not just as an extension of the family you came from." Elena, meanwhile, was developing into a confident and outgoing child who seemed largely unaware of her family's unusual circumstances. At 8, she was friends with children from a variety of backgrounds, equally comfortable at playdates in modest apartments and elaborate birthday parties in Beverly Hills mansions. It was Elena who forced the family to confront the question of how much to share with the children about Alex's business dealings. During a school project about family history, Elena had announced to her class that her father was an import and export, an explanation that had worked fine until one of her classmates' parents had done some research and approached the teacher with concerns about Elena's family background. The teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was diplomatic but direct when she called Grace to discuss the situation. "She's a wonderful child," Mrs. Patterson said, "and we've never had any problems with her behavior or her academic work. But some parents are expressing concerns about whether it's appropriate for her to be in classes with their children." Grace felt a familiar surge of protective anger, but she kept her voice calm and professional. "What exactly are these parents suggesting?" she asked. "They're worried about the influence she might have on their children," Mrs. Patterson explained. "They're concerned about the kind of values she might be learning at home." Grace took a deep breath, recognizing that this conversation was inevitable, but still feeling unprepared for the reality of it. "Mrs. Patterson," she said carefully, "Elena is 8 years old. She's never been exposed to any aspect of her father's business that isn't completely legal and appropriate. She's being raised to value kindness, honesty, academic achievement, and respect for others. If you'd like to discuss her actual behavior or academic performance, I'm happy to do that. But I won't engage in speculation about her character based on other people's assumptions about her family." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Grace maintaining her composure while making it clear that any attempt to exclude Elena from normal school activities would be met with appropriate legal action. When she hung up the phone, she was shaking with anger and frustration. Alex found her in the kitchen 20 minutes later, still processing the conversation and trying to decide how much to share with Elena about the situation. When Grace explained what had happened, Alex's expression went carefully blank, the look he wore when he was containing emotions that could be dangerous if released. "Which parents?" he asked quietly. "We're not doing that," Grace said firmly, recognizing the direction of his thoughts. "We're not using intimidation or influence to solve social problems. We're going to handle this the way any other family would handle it, through communication and appropriate channels." Alex studied her face, clearly struggling with his instinct to protect his family through the methods he knew best. "How?" he asked finally. "How do we protect her from people who have decided she's guilty by association?" "We teach her to be proud of who she is," Grace said. "We teach her that some people will judge her unfairly, but that her job is to control her own behavior and let her actions speak for themselves. And we make sure she knows that our love for her has nothing to do with other people's opinions. That evening, Grace and Alex sat down with both children to have the conversation they had been postponing for years. Elena listened with wide eyes as they explained that their family was different from most families, that Alex's work sometimes involved complicated situations that other people didn't understand or approve of. "Does that mean I'm bad?" Elena asked, her voice small and uncertain. "It means you're ours," Alex said, pulling her onto his lap. "It means you're loved and protected and valued for exactly who you are. Some people might not understand our family, but that doesn't change anything about how special you are." Mateo, who had been listening quietly, spoke up for the first time. "It means we have to be better than other kids," he said matter-of-factly. "We have to work harder to prove that we're good people, because some people want to believe we're not." Grace felt her heart break a little at the matter-of-fact acceptance in her son's voice, the evidence that he had already learned lessons no child should have to learn. But she also felt proud of his resilience and his understanding of the situation. "That's right," she said. "But it also means we have opportunities other children don't have, resources and privileges that come with responsibilities. Our job is to use those advantages to help other people, to prove that having more than you need makes you more generous, not more selfish." The family meeting that followed became the first of many conversations about ethics, responsibility, and the complex relationship between privilege and obligation. Grace and Alex were careful to be age-appropriate in their discussions, but they also wanted their children to understand that wealth and power came with the responsibility to use those resources constructively. As Elena grew older and more sophisticated in her understanding of social dynamics, she began to approach the challenges of her family situation with characteristic directness. When classmates made comments about her father's reputation, she would respond with questions that forced them to examine their own assumptions. "Have you ever met my dad?" she would ask. "Do you know anything about him besides what you heard from your parents? Because if you want to judge him, maybe you should actually get to know him first." It was a strategy that often caught her peers off guard, but it was also effective in shifting conversations away from speculation and toward more substantive discussions about fairness and prejudice. Elena's teachers began to notice that she had a gift for helping other children think more critically about their beliefs and assumptions. Grace watched her daughter navigate these challenges with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing that Elena was developing skills that would serve her well in life, but also that she was having to grow up faster than other children her age. When Elena turned 10, Alex suggested that they throw her a birthday party that would include her entire class, regardless of their parents' feelings about the Moretti family. It was a risk, but it was also an opportunity to show other families who they really were when they weren't being filtered through media speculation and gossip. The party was held at their home, with elaborate decorations and entertainment that would have impressed any child, but Alex and Grace were careful to interact with every family personally, demonstrating the same warmth and respect they showed to their closest friends. Several parents who had been skeptical about Elena's family background left the party with dramatically different impressions. They saw Alex playing soccer with their children, Grace helping shy kids feel included in group activities, and a family that operated on principles of kindness and inclusivity rather than intimidation or ostentation. It was a small victory, but an important one for Elena's social development and for the family's integration into the broader community. Grace realized that this was how they would continue to handle prejudice and misunderstanding, not through confrontation or avoidance, but through patient demonstration of their actual values and character. As the years passed and Grace's clinical practice continued to grow, she found herself increasingly called upon to speak at conferences and workshops about family resilience and trauma recovery. Her unique background, combining academic credentials with personal experience of family crisis and healing, made her a sought-after expert in the field. These speaking engagements took her around the country, sometimes internationally, sharing insights about how families could survive and thrive in the face of extraordinary challenges. It was professionally fulfilling work, but it also meant time away from Alex and the children, a sacrifice that required careful negotiation and planning. Alex supported Grace's professional development without question, but he also made sure she understood that her family would always be her highest priority. Not because her work wasn't important, but because they had built something too precious to take for granted. Every time you come home from a conference, Elena runs to the door to greet you, he told Grace one evening as she prepared for a trip to Chicago. And every time, I'm reminded of how much we all depend on you being present in our lives, not just physically, but emotionally available and engaged. Grace nodded, understanding that Alex was not trying to limit her professional growth, but reminding her of the delicate balance required to maintain both career and family successfully. I never want to become so focused on helping other families that I neglect our own, she said. That would defeat the entire purpose of the work. It was this awareness that led Grace to make one of the most important decisions of her career. Instead of expanding her individual practice or joining a large therapeutic group, she decided to start a nonprofit organization focused on providing family therapy services to families who couldn't afford private treatment. The Moretti Family Center, as it came to be known, was funded primarily through Alex's business ventures, but Grace was careful to structure it in ways that maintained her professional independence and ethical standards. The center offered sliding scale fees, bilingual services, and specialized programs for families dealing with trauma, addiction, and loss. It was ambitious and challenging work, requiring Grace to develop skills in administration and fundraising that went beyond her clinical training. But it also allowed her to have the kind of impact on her community that felt like a natural extension of Margaret's legacy of caring for people who had nowhere else to turn. The center's first major success story involved a family whose father had been deported, leaving behind a mother and 3 children who were struggling with financial hardship, language barriers, and complex legal issues. Grace and her staff worked with the family for over a year, providing therapy, connecting them with legal resources, and helping them develop a support network that could sustain them through the uncertainty of their situation. When the father was finally able to return to the United States through legal channels, the family had not only survived his absence, but had developed new strengths and resilience that would serve them well in the future. It was the kind of comprehensive intervention that Grace had envisioned when she first conceived of the center, and it validated her belief that families could overcome even the most challenging circumstances with appropriate support. As news of the center's work spread throughout Los Angeles, Grace found herself in the unusual position of being recognized as a community leader rather than simply as Alessandro Moretti's wife. It was a shift in perception that took some adjustment, but it also felt like the natural result of years of proving herself through her actions rather than her associations. The center's annual fundraising gala became one of the most sought-after events in Los Angeles, not because of its glamour or exclusivity, but because it brought together people from across the social and economic spectrum who were committed to supporting families in crisis. Grace took particular pride in the diversity of the event's attendees, from prominent business leaders to former clients who had rebuilt their lives with the center's support. During the center's 5th anniversary celebration, Grace was invited to speak about the organization's impact and future goals. As she stood at the podium, looking out at an audience that included her family, her staff, her clients, and supporters from throughout the community, she felt a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with external recognition and everything to do with living out her values in meaningful ways. 5 years ago, Grace began, I started this center because I believe that every family deserves access to the support and resources they need to heal from trauma and build stronger relationships. Tonight, I want to share some statistics that demonstrate the impact we've had together. She went on to describe the hundreds of families they had served, the measurable improvements in child welfare and family stability that resulted from their interventions, and the expansion of services that would allow them to reach even more families in the coming years. But statistics don't tell the whole story, Grace continued. The real measure of our success is in the individual lives that have been changed, the children who are sleeping safely in their beds tonight because their parents learned new ways to manage conflict, the couples who stayed together through crisis because they had someone to help them remember why they fell in love in the first place. She paused, looking directly at Alex and the children, who were seated at a table near the front of the room. My own family taught me that love is not about perfection or avoiding difficulties, Grace said. It's about choosing to stay present and engaged when life becomes complicated, about believing that people can grow and change and heal from even the most painful experiences. That's the foundation of everything we do here, and it's the reason I believe this work is so important." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but what mattered most to Grace were the tears in Alex's eyes and the proud smiles on Mateo and Elena's faces. They understood, perhaps better than anyone in the audience, how much this work meant to her and how it had grown naturally out of the healing their own family had experienced. After the event, as the family drove home through the quiet streets of their neighborhood, Elena asked a question that had clearly been on her mind throughout the evening. "Mama," she said from the back seat, "when I grow up, do you think I'll want to do work like yours?" Grace turned around to look at her daughter, now 12 years old, and beginning to think seriously about her own future. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I hope you'll find work that feels meaningful to you, whatever that might be. The important thing is not what you do, but that you do it with love and intention." "I think I might want to be a teacher," Elena said thoughtfully. "Or maybe a doctor. Something where I can help people feel better when they're scared or hurting." "Those are both wonderful possibilities," Alex said from the driver's seat. "But you have plenty of time to figure out what calls to you. The most important thing is that you grow up knowing you have choices, and that you use those choices to make the world a little bit better." Mateo, now 15 and increasingly interested in pursuing photography professionally, spoke up for the first time during the drive. "I want to take pictures that help people understand each other better," he said. "Like, show them that families come in all different shapes, but they all have the same kinds of love and problems and hopes." Grace felt a surge of pride at her son's sophisticated understanding of his artistic goals. "That sounds like exactly the kind of work that would make a real difference," she said. "And it sounds like something that would make great-grandmother very proud." As they pulled into their driveway, Grace reflected on how far they had all come from that night in the restaurant when a broken little boy had thrown dishes and she had made the decision to kneel down beside him. That single act of compassion had led to a love deeper than she had ever imagined, a family that had healed each other's wounds, and a life dedicated to helping other families find their own paths to healing and connection. Sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones that seem smallest at the time, she thought. Sometimes all it takes to change everything is one person willing to see past the chaos to the pain underneath and to offer kindness instead of judgment. Looking at Alex and their children as they walked toward their home together, Grace knew that she had been given something precious beyond measure. Not just love, but the opportunity to use that love in service of something larger than their own happiness. It was a gift she intended to treasure and protect for the rest of her life.